Well, here we are again. Good morning to you. And what happened yesterday, um, or I should say, what happened Friday, was the one tusk fell down. Do you remember this? Okay, so the one tusk fell, and now we know it's another tribe. It is not Kimba's tribe, and it's not the others, because the others are a different hominid. They're not the same. They're not the same species. They're not the same type. So this is another group that is the same as Kimba's tribe. So let's find out about that. A lot of things to figure out right now. So this is chapter 12. Kimba watched as the immense, shaggy form struck the rocks below. The hunters cheered and charged the rest of the herd, hoping to force more of the mammoths over the ledge. His pursuit was ended, Kimba realized. For long moments, he stared down at that awesome body. The one tusk had been destroyed. It was hard to grasp the fact, but it was so. The one tusk was dead, and Rab would live. Joy suddenly surged within him. It was so. The enemy had been conquered. Now Rab would live. Now Kimba would accomplish what he had set out to do. Now he would repay Rab. Now the spear maker would live to hunt again. But he must hurry. Kimba let out a whoop of victory and scampered wildly down the slope to the gully below. There would be little time, he knew. These hunters would quickly claim their kill, and they must have seen him passing on the trail above while they waited in ambush for the mammoths. They knew he was somewhere about, and they might very well search for him. Even in death, the one tusk looked menacing. It almost seemed as if the monstrous body might suddenly arise and utter that horrifying bellow. The dog sniffed the one tusk warily, as if it too could hardly believe that the raging mighty one had been vanquished. There was a low rumble in the dog's throat as it paced around and around the fallen monarch. But there was no time to marvel. The hunters on the trail had ceased shouting, and no more mammoths had come crashing down. The rest of the herd apparently had escaped. That meant the hunters would soon appear, and the tip of the tusk would not be easy to obtain. Kimba rubbed his hand over the long, smooth curve of the tusk and made a discovery. The ivory had been badly cracked by the fall. It was all but broken off already. Rejoicing, he hacked at the shattered tusk with Rab's knife. The tip was very loose. He tugged at it, working it back and forth. Suddenly, it tore free. The boy stumbled backward, clutching it tightly. In wonder, he held up the jagged sliver. He had it at last. "Come, quick," he called to the dog. He ran to the head of the gully where he could climb back up the slope he had descended and return to the game trail. He would make a half circle around this plateau until the afternoon sun was on his left cheek. Then he would set a straight course for the tribal cave. If he did not tarry along the way, he could be there in 2 days. Kimba felt fresh, invigorated, triumphant. The dog caught his spirit and rushed past the boy, frisking like a puppy. You know how dogs do that. They catch your spirit. You get all excited. They don't know why, but they get excited too. Then the dog slid to a stop in the melting snow, and its muzzle wrinkled in a snarl. A man advanced on them with a throwing stick and javelin in his hand. Behind him was another man, then another. Kimba whirled, darting off at a tangent. Another hunter materialized in front of him. The boy turned back in the direction of the one tusk, but 3 more hunters appeared from a clump of scrubby pines only a few paces to his left. It seemed clear to him that these hunters had seen him descend to the gully and had quickly and stealthily followed. The dog vaulted at the nearest man, downing him. A second circled them, looking for a chance to lunge at the animal. A third hunter came for Kimba. The boy raised his spear, and the hunter stopped. He had his throwing stick poised. The deadly javelin was ready. Each studied the other cautiously. There was a rush of footsteps. Kimba was grabbed from behind by the throat. His spear was wrenched from him. He reached for Rab's knife, and it too was torn from his hand. Then he was pushed to the earth. Above him stood half a score of hunters, big men like those of his own tribe, wedged shoulder to shoulder, one of them brandishing a knife that stooped toward the boy. "No," another hunter stopped him. Kimba hastily tucked the ivory tip from the one tusk into the pouch containing his fire kindling. They must not take it from him. The hunters allowed him to rise. The dog had eased closer to the stunted pines. The hunters now turned from the boy and began moving slowly toward the dog. They crouched, readying their weapons. One man launched his javelin, but the dog was off with the flash of the hunter's arm. The javelin quivered in the ground. The second hunter made his cast, aiming ahead of the dog, but the animal's speed was too great, and it was instantly out of sight. Grunting angrily, the man with the knife again bent toward Kimba. Once more he was pulled back. "No!" yelled a man who Kimba had not noticed before. He was taller and slimmer than the rest of the band. His forehead was high and bulging, and the skin of his face was taut, like animal hide that had been stretched too nearly the breaking point. The hunter stood aside as this man approached Kimba. "He is young. He is quick. We can use him." The man's voice was soft and musical, like the cooing sound of a songbird. "He is bad," declared the man with the knife. "He is not like us. He and the dog are the same pack." "We can use him," said the slender young man. Kimba found he could understand what they said, although the accent was different from his own tribe's. "One dog escaped. We will kill the other," insisted the hunter with the knife. "No." The young man spoke with authority. He was not armed. He wore across his shoulders a mantle that was white as snow. His arms and legs were painted with bright-colored circles, dots, and snaky lines. Then Kimba knew that the young man was to this tribe what Utrecht was to his: the sorcerer, the wizard, the healer, the prophet. He leveled his cold gaze on Kimba. Suddenly he seized the boy's cheek, cutting into the skin with fingernails as long as claws. He pulled Kimba's face closer to his own and studied it a long while. Long, sharp fingernails, and they cut into Kimba's cheek, actually drawing blood. Not very kind at this point. "We will take him," said the sorcerer. He swung around and pointed in the direction of the one tusk. "There is meat, as my spell provided, a mighty one, which I created for you, which I led you to. Go get the meat. Tonight, the tribe will feast." When the hunters began the arduous task of slicing up the one tusk, Kimba discovered how they would use him. He was to carry a solid slab of meat cut from the mammoth's back. The load was much heavier than the one he had carried to his own tribe from the mighty one slain by the one tusk. The weight of this load nearly doubled him over. I don't know if you've ever carried something very heavy for a long time, for like a long hike. It's hard. It's one of the worst things you can do. It is so hard. Each of the hunters hoisted a chunk of the same size onto his back. So you had men carrying the same load that, 10-year-old Kimba or 11-year-old Kimba is carrying. I guess he's 11, right? 11 or 12. Onto his back. 4 men were required to transport the meat from one leg alone. Darkness was approaching, but they were in a merry mood, chortling, tearing off pieces from their kill, and eating as they walked along. Kimba wondered what his fate would have been if they had failed to down a mighty one and had been filled with hunger and irritability. He would have to pass the night with these hunters, he knew. This would be the 3rd night he had spent away from the tribe, and it was becoming more and more urgent that he begin his journey back. Perhaps the hunters would let him leave when he had finished carrying his load, perhaps they would permit him to be on his way. He tried hard to keep concentrating on the need to bring the piece of ivory tusk back to Rab, but it became harder to do so because the huge mound of dripping meat grew heavier with every step. Soon he could think of nothing but reaching the place where they would permit him to drop his burden and rest beside it. It was shortly after dark when he became aware that they had arrived at their destination. Shouts burst from the hunters' throats. Shrill, excited cries answered them. Women, children, and elders of the tribe ran up, rejoicing at the prospect of fresh food and enough meat to last for many, many days. More squeals went up at the sight of the stranger. A young one, some of the women yelled. A two-legged dog, said a hunter, laughing. The meat was pulled from Kimba's back and he slumped to the ground, but the sorcerer's foot thumped him in the ribs. He motioned the boy to stand. I carried the one tusk's meat, Kimba said. Now let me go. My friend Rab. The sorcerer gestured sharply, annoyed. He indicated a group of chattering women. Go with them. Do what they tell you. Do not try to flee. His eyes narrowed and fixed on Kimba, reminding him of a saber-tooth's. Then the sorcerer turned and stalked away. As tired as he was, Kimba yet looked closely at his surroundings. The people of this tribe lived in a series of caves burrowing into the side of a limestone plateau. Like his own cave, they faced south to give shelter from the freezing winds that blew northward in the season of snow and cold. None of these caves, he noticed, was very large. They appeared to be little more than cramped holes. A stout woman dragged Kimba to a raging fire that had been built in a deep pit. Small children giggled and stared. Older ones pinched him, laughing, or pointed to his eyes, glinting green in the light of the flames. An old woman with stringy hair that hung to her waist seemed to be in charge of preparations for the feast. She brushed the children aside and jerked a finger at Kimba. Get wood! He ambled off, searching the ground. Fast! Forcing himself to move more rapidly, Kimba went to the fringe of the camp. As he gathered up a pile of branches, he began to entertain a flicker of hope. Might not this chore provide him with an opportunity to run off into the darkness? But almost at once he observed that several young men of the tribe had strolled after him and were watching from only a few steps away. Wood! The old woman shrieked. Kimba hastened back with the armload he had collected. It would not do anyway to slip away tonight, he realized. He was far too weary. The burden he had carried seemed to have put a permanent crimp in his spine. The faces of his captors suddenly looked like fuzzy blobs. Their words became a meaningless babble. The cook fire sent smoke and sparks high into the night sky. No one ordered him on any more errands. He edged closer to the warmth of the fire and flopped to the ground. A gruff voice awakened him, and rough hands yanked him up. Many of the tribe were leaping around the fire. Others still gorged themselves on the flesh of the one tusk. After finishing the meat, they heated the bones and broke them in half to get at the melted marrow. Kimba was dragged to some low, rounded rocks. No one spoke to him, but surrounded by so many of them, he knew it would be impossible to escape. He wondered if he would be given any meat, and then he slept. The shivering of his body returned him to consciousness. It was quiet now, and the fire was little more than embers. The many revelers who had been all around him were gone. Was he free? The question brought him more sharply awake. But he knew instantly that the answer was no. Two hunters with their spears held upright sat beside the fire, turning now and then to catch the sights and sounds of the night. He heard a stirring nearby and saw the form of another hunter, probably another lookout, outlined by the half moon. No, they were alert and ready to stop him from disappearing into the shadows. He sat up and propped his body against a rock. The night air was cold and the earth still layered with snow in many places. was even colder. Have you ever tried to sleep when you're too cold? That's hard. He and the dog are of the same pack, one of the hunters had said, and now they were treating him as little more than an animal, a creature not to be given shelter, food, or warmth. He would have to creep nearer the fire, Kimba decided. The hunters probably would warn him away, but he must try it. The chill was settling into his bones. Soon he would suffer too much discomfort to sleep, and without rest, without strength, he could not make the journey home. Even right now, think of what he's gone through. Think about what his body has gone through, the falls and the slides and the hiking and the running and the climbing and the almost drowning and the not sleeping and being too cold and carrying that huge piece of meat for all those, however long they had to travel. Ugh. Then he became aware of a savory smell. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a spot. He felt the piece of tusk within his tunic. Rab, I will yet bring this to you, he murmured. Then he became aware of a savory smell. Bending over him was a small, smiling girl, his own age or a season younger, bearing on a stick a smoking piece of meat. She extended it to Kimba. When he hesitated, she placed his hand around the stick. Eat, she said. Kimba did, first nibbling and then fiercely attacking the food. The girl sat on her heels, smiling more broadly as she watched. When the stick was bare of meat, he licked his fingers. Then the girl pulled a fur covering over to him. She dropped it beside Kimba, got up, and began to melt away into the blackness. Who are you? Was all he could blurt out. She half turned and only smiled. Who are you? Kimba asked more loudly. Nupa, said the girl softly, and was gone. Kimba wrapped himself in the skin she had left. He stretched out, warm and comfortable. Nupa, he said to himself, and then he slept. Okay, chapter 13 will be tomorrow. Kimba's got to get out of there. He's got to escape somehow and take that piece of tusk, the magic piece of tusk that will heal Rab. And right now he's captive. But it looks like someone's nice to him, a girl named Nupa. Okay. All right, guys. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.